Okay, here are some instructions for completing the theme chunking task of your unit planning. And if you haven't done so, make sure you read the 2 paragraphs describing this on page 138 in the book. But I'm going to walk you through it here as well. All right, so the theme chunking is the next step after you've unpacked the standards and you've created your basic scope and sequence. And the first step is to look through the KDUs from your 2 documents that you've already done before, the unpacking the standards and the scope and sequence, and then just looking at those, create a bullet point list of those KDUs. And so doing it for the example that's in the book, the biology curriculum example that's in there, I looked at and I had 2 big categories, and then I had these smaller bullet points of categories. And most likely what you'll end up with is not these categories here, but most students at this stage, what they end up with looking at their KDUs is just a long bullet point list of the things they have to know, do, and understand here in the subtopics field. Then the next step is to generate some questions. And so looking at these, I take a look at those, and then I basically convert those into questions. And you don't necessarily have to have a single question for every single topic or bullet point over here. You might end up with, if these are very specific concepts, you might end up with one question that maybe covers multiples of those. And in doing this, then I'm not worrying about the size of the question, like what's the breadth of the question, how many lessons might it take to answer that question. I'm just writing down the questions. And then as I look at it, I can see that, okay, these 2 questions here are much broader, and so they might become my sub-thematic questions. And then the rest of the questions here are much more specific. You know, they're what is kind of questions, and those will become my guiding questions, or some version of those might become my guiding questions for the unit plan. As you do these, if you don't have identified subtopics over here and you just have a list of bullet points, you'll have a list of questions here, and you'll have to look at those and decide, okay, this unit is big enough that I need to break it into smaller chunks, like I did with the biology unit. I broke it into 2 subunits, basically, with a quiz at the end of each one of these. And so I determined that I have 2 sub-thematic questions in this unit. If your questions all look to be about the same amount of breadth of content that they would cover, then you probably don't have sub-thematic questions. You just have guiding questions. And so your unit plan is just going to have a thematic question and then a series of guiding questions. Unlike the example in the book, which is a thematic question and then 2 sub-thematic questions that break it into smaller pieces, and then the guiding questions. And that's really just a judgment call on your part. You have to think about, how big is this unit? And would I need to break it into smaller pieces with some kind of formal assessment so I know that they're on track? So for example, this biology unit takes about 6 weeks. Well, that's way too long to have no formal assessment to see how they're doing along the way. And so when designing it, I realized it's a pretty big unit. I need to break it into 2 pieces. And so then I looked for what are the logical groupings of those topics to break it into smaller pieces of a kind of a mini unit. And so as I looked at my original thematic question, then I realized I had about half the unit was talking about energy and about half of the unit was talking about matter. And so that's where I made my decision. Okay, I'm going to break this into 2 sub-themes, and each sub-theme will have a formal quiz at the end of it to know that where they're at with that piece before we move on to the next piece of the unit. So your task here then with this is to first look at all your KDUs and then fill in by just bullet pointing the things they have to know, do, and understand. Those become your subtopics for this unit. And then from there, look at those and convert them into questions. And you don't have to worry about the size of the question yet, or even if you think it's a really good and engaging question yet. You're just getting your first ideas down for the questions.